The U.S. Army had soldiers, weapons, and months of searching behind them, but Felipe Espinosa and his nephew José Vicente were still hiding somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. Every trail vanished. Every search failed. Then Tom Tobin entered the wilderness with a different kind of weapon, the ability to read clues that most people never noticed. And what he followed through those mountains was a trail so subtle that it took a single tracker to find what an entire force could not. By October 1863, the bloody Espinosas had become two of the most feared fugitives in southern Colorado. Their attacks on travelers, settlers, and isolated ranches had spread fear across the region. People knew the killings were connected to the Espinosas, but knowing who was responsible did not mean knowing where they were. The army had searched for them before, but the mountains kept swallowing every trail. The Sangre de Cristo Range was a difficult place to hunt anyone. Steep ridges, thick forests, narrow valleys, and hidden routes created endless places to disappear. A group could search for days and still miss a camp hidden only a short distance away. The problem was not a lack of effort. The problem was that the Espinosas understood the land. They knew where to move, where to hide, and how to leave as little behind as possible. To defeat them, the army needed someone who could think the same way. That person was Tom Tobin, and he wasn't about to search the mountains the way everyone else had. At Fort Garland, Colonel Samuel Tappan turned to Tobin because he had the experience that regular soldiers lacked. Tobin was a mountain man, hunter, and scout who had spent years learning how to survive in a difficult country. He understood that the wilderness was never truly silent. Animals moved differently. People left traces. The land recorded every decision. Before Tobin left Fort Garland, he already had some information to work with. Reports from survivors and witnesses suggested that the Espinosas were operating south of the fort, around the mountain corridors near La Veta Pass and the surrounding Sangre de Cristo region. He knew they were avoiding settlements and relying on isolated terrain to stay ahead of their pursuers, but that information only gave him a place to start. The real challenge was finding two men who had learned how not to be found. Tobin initially rode out with a military detachment. Lieutenant Horace W. Baldwin accompanied him with around 15 soldiers, and some accounts also mention additional scouts joining the search. On paper, it looked like enough force to capture two fugitives. On paper, 15 soldiers looked like an advantage. In the mountains, they became the problem. The soldiers brought power, but they also brought noise. A large group could not move quietly through rough country. Horses disturbed the ground, equipment knocked against saddles, boots broke branches, voices carried through valleys where even a small sound could travel a long distance. Tobin immediately saw the problem, and this was the moment the hunt truly changed. The army had been searching for criminals, but Tobin understood he was searching for a pattern. The Espinosas had survived because they were alert. They knew how to notice approaching danger before danger reached them. If a military group moved through the mountains making constant noise, the killers could simply disappear again. So Tobin changed the way he searched. He separated from the larger group and began working with fewer men around him. He stopped searching like a soldier and started tracking like a hunter. Near La Veta Pass and the country around South Abeta Creek, Tobin began following a trail that was almost invisible. There was no clear road leading to the Espinosas, no obvious path marked by footprints. The evidence existed only in small details scattered across the landscape. A broken branch in thick brush, a patch of disturbed soil, marks showing where an animal had been moved. These were things most people would ignore. Tobin understood they were messages. A tracker does not just ask where someone went. A tracker asks why they went there. The terrain itself gave him more information. Fallen timber could force travelers into certain routes. Water sources could reveal where people had stopped. Ridges provided views across the landscape but also exposed anyone standing in the open. Every choice mattered. If Tobin moved too quickly, he could reveal himself. If he moved too slowly, the Espinosas could vanish again. He had to understand the mountains from the perspective of the men he was hunting. Then the mountains finally gave Tobin his first real break: a stolen ox. Accounts describe Tobin discovering signs connected to the animal, and one version says he recognized the brand as belonging to John Francisco, someone he knew. The detail gave him something more valuable than a simple trail. It gave him a reason. The Espinosas were not just passing through the area. They had stopped. They needed food. They had taken the animal and likely created a temporary camp nearby. But the most unusual clue was still ahead. As Tobin continued through the mountains, something above the trees caught his attention: magpies. The birds were circling repeatedly over one area. To most people, they would have looked like ordinary wildlife, but experienced frontiersmen knew that scavengers gathered for a reason. Something had died below. Tobin followed the birds. What he found was the remains of the butchered ox. The discovery confirmed what the other clues had been telling him. The Espinosas had been there. They had stopped long enough to leave behind evidence. The carcass was not just a source of food, it was a marker. And somewhere nearby was the camp Tobin had been searching for. Now came the hardest part of the hunt. Finding the trail was one thing. Getting close enough to identify the men was another. A careless approach could destroy everything. The Espinosas had avoided capture for months because they were careful. If they realized someone was watching them, they could disappear into the mountains again. So Tobin moved slowly. He used trees, rocks, and uneven ground to conceal himself. He watched before moving closer. He waited until he could confirm that the trail had led him to the right place. From his hidden position, Tobin saw two men at the camp. The exact details of the final moment differ between accounts, but the important part remains consistent. The location matched the trail. The stolen animal matched the evidence. The two men matched the description of the fugitives he had been following. Tom Tobin had found Felipe Espinosa and José Vicente. The men who had escaped soldiers and posses for months were finally within reach. Then the silence broke. Once Tobin's position was discovered, the careful tracking turned into a violent confrontation. Gunfire erupted, and the hunt ended with Felipe Espinosa and José Vicente Espinosa dead. The terror that had spread across southern Colorado was finally over, but Tobin still had to prove it. On the frontier, finding the right men was not enough. There were no modern identification systems, no photographs sent instantly across the country, and no forensic methods to settle every doubt. So Tobin returned to Fort Garland, carrying proof. He brought back the severed heads of Felipe and José Vicente Espinosa in a sack and presented them to Colonel Tappan. The bloody Espinosas had finally been found. But the reason Tom Tobin's story survived was not only because of the final gunfight. What makes Tobin's hunt remarkable is that he succeeded where a larger force had failed. Not because he had more men or more weapons, but because he understood the landscape in a way his opponents never could. In a place where the mountains seemed to hide everything, Tobin realized they were actually revealing the truth to anyone patient enough to listen. He won the hunt by understanding something the Espinosas had underestimated. The wilderness was not empty. It was always leaving evidence. The tracks, the stolen ox, the birds. Most people looked at those mountains and saw only wilderness. Tom Tobin saw a trail, and by following clues that almost everyone else missed, he found two killers who believed they could disappear forever.